The Bob Murphy Show, episode 440.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Bob Murphy Show. Oh boy, is this a nice nerdy one for you folks. I've got Ian Deters back. You may remember him way back on episode 287. He defended the use of infinity in higher mathematics from Steve Patterson's scurrilous attacks. So now Ian's back. I had given him a project a while ago, and the fault is mine that it took me a while to follow up with him and give him feedback. But it has to do with fractional reserve banking, and we're doing a simulation to test some of the claims that I would often make when talking about this. Specifically about, here's what would happen in a genuinely free market in banking. Notice the tight constraints on any individual bank's credit expansion. And then, the central bank comes in and weakens those constraints, right? So I've been talking like that a lot lately. And so what I had Ian do was do a computer simulation to see, are my claims accurate, first of all, and then can we learn anything else from it? So that's what we're discussing in this episode. What's funny is I didn't get a chance to review his results beforehand. And so you're watching me just live process this stuff. So I think that might help you, the listener or viewer, go through it yourself, because I'm kind of talking out loud and digesting it. Ian, I guess you always talk out loud. I'm thinking out loud, and then Ian's giving me feedback. So there's that element, but also you can see my excitement as I'm realizing, So it's a good mixture. The punchline is my claims were a little fuzzy, and so it's sort of like they're true under certain conditions, but in general, things are more open-ended. However, I think in the grand scheme, the constraints on fractional reserve banking are actually tighter than I originally thought, right? And so this episode will spell all that out. Let me motivate it this way in case you are an Austro-libertarian who likes Rothbard, and you're just wondering, geez, do I want to listen to this episode? I'm going to send this to people in the Mises Institute, like the senior fellows who are into the banking issue, because there's some results in here that surprised me and I think are going to surprise them. So if you're saying, if Bob thinks it's that significant, so there you go. Last thing I'll mention here is, two things. One is you definitely, if you're going to consume this episode, you want to do the YouTube version, because Ian did a whole slide deck and he presents some numerical examples to illustrate these possibilities. You need to be looking at it, otherwise it's not going to make any sense. And the other thing is, Ian is a professional mathematician, and he actually, in 2023, started EP Analytic Solutions, which is a consulting practice that he works with clients to build predictive models, with high precision results. And so I think, if you're somebody who could benefit from having a mathematical model builder work on something that you assign, then, by all means, why don't you contact Ian? And I put information in the show notes page as to how you can get in touch with him. He turns stuff around really fast, and he's very good at being able to speak and playing English, but then also going ahead and doing the high-powered math if the problem is amenable to it. So I would highly recommend him. He put in a lot of hours into this project, and so the least I can do is give a plug for his consulting practice. So without further ado, here is my discussion, sort of handing over the floor to Ian Deters. He presents his results on our simulation of fractional reserve banking, and I periodically stop him to ask questions. I think you'll like it. Ian, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show.
Well, thanks for having me back, Bob. I appreciate it.
Yeah, your last episode where you were defending infinity and the use of it, there are some people who have strong views on that, and I have gotten feedback. That was one of the, I don't want to say most commented on, but over the years, people will say stuff and some people will still come up to me and say, "Oh yeah, I really like that episode where that guy was defending Infinity." So there you go.
Good.
So what we're talking about tonight, folks, I probably would have given a little bit of the backstory in the pre-recorded introduction, but Ian and I agreed before we hit the go button here that we kind of didn't need to hear each other talking about the context, so we're on the same footing. The short story is I have been doing a ton lately on fractional reserve banking, and when I explain like Murray Rothbard's view, and I recently just did this for the Human Action podcast, folks, and to explain like how a genuinely free market in banking would work and why Rothbard think there would be natural feedback mechanisms that would keep the fraction, like for demand deposits, close to 100%, even without like formal government regulation and, mandating that outcome. And he analyzes it and says, oh yeah, because if one bank has a reserve ratio higher than you start out with an original equilibrium. If one bank then gets aggressive and lowers its reserve ratio up, there's automatic forces that kick in that drain like the gold, if that's what the base money is, out of its vaults and into the vaults of all of its rivals. So that's why one bank doesn't want to unilaterally inflate too much. And then you can say, well, what if they all formed a cartel and they all inflated in unison? So they all start out like, 99% reserve ratios, and they all just agreed, let's systematically and in unison reduce our reserve ratios down to 80 and 70 and 60. And like all of the claims of our clients will just be largely offsetting. So we won't be draining each other of gold. And then he explains there's, two problems with that is number one, not all the banks are going to have the same standards. Some are going to be more conservative than others. And so that's one of the reasons, like in general, cartels are hard to maintain because they're not all uniform. And so, they're like the safer banks might not want to just throw their lot in with the riskier banks. So that's one element. But also, even if they could all form a cartel like that, what's to stop someone from opening up a new bank and having a reserve ratio that's 10 percentage points higher? And then that person starts getting all the gold over time as they gain market share. So that was the framework that Rothbard sets up as the foil to our world, where he says, oh, but then the central bank comes in and it's systematically acting as lender of last resort, imposing uniform regulations, and crucially, having really hard rules that you got to follow and roadblocks in the way to open up a new bank. Because, oh yeah, banking, that's like a really important. You can't just have people open up banks like pizza shops, right? So all the things that the public thinks the central bank should be doing in the public interest counteract all of those checks that the market has on bank credit inflation. Okay, so I always, go through those arguments. I wrote them up in my study guide for Man, Economy, and State, I believe. I certainly went through that stuff when I did Choice. And it occurred to me that, maybe I should check and just make sure that when I go through that story about this is what would happen to the bank reserves, depending on the reserve ratios, that actually works, because you can kind of picture a little bit in your head, but I thought, we could simulate that. That's pretty straightforward. And that was always something on the back of my mind. And then I realized, well, Ian here, he's a smart guy. He can do stuff with computing machines and whatnot. And so I asked him a while ago, hey, can we do like a simulation? And so that's the genesis of this. That's how this began. So I'll stop there. And Ian, do you want to take over the tale?
Yeah, just a few remarks to contextualize this, because I want to make sure that even from my own understanding of where this fits in sort of the Austrian framework and the Austrian program, which is that basically, one of the things that we're trying to do, of course, is point toward a freer society, a more liberty-minded society. And part of that is free banking in a certain sense, meaning unhampered by, say, a central bank. Of course, one of the problems with the central bank is what the interest rate is a price, and prices are signals. And because they're monkeying about with that, that's one of the things that leads to boom and bust. So we don't want that. But another one of the things that, is linked with booms and busts is credit expansion, right? And so then it becomes the task, because of course we don't live in a world without central banking. It becomes the task of libertarians and Austrians to try to imagine, okay, what would things be like, if we could get rid of the central bank? And so if we could, then you do away with the monkeying around with the interest rate as well as with the money expansion. But But then you still have this question of free banking, right? Like, would there be 100% reserve ratios, or, would there be fractional reserve banking? Would that still be the case? And so there's sort of two ways to think about this. One is the historical approach, which is, I think, what's been championed by Selgin, where he says, hey, look at Scotland, look at Canada, right? And of course, you in times past have rebutted those arguments from a historical perspective. And so sans that, it's not really clear what would happen, because we don't have a lot of historical data on this. And to your point, with the lady who tried to set up Custodia Bank, Caitlin Long, she's run into all sorts of hurdles, some of which I believe have had to have been addressed by Selgin. And so really, it's somewhat unfortunate, but it leaves us with, I think, only one path, which is simulation, which is, well, let's pretend and just see what happens, right? And so I think that's where this work fits in the whole sort of libertarian program. Is we want to be liberty-minded. We don't want a central bank. We're trying to avoid boom and bust. We want to imagine what will happen. History is not much of a guide. And so thus we go to simulation, and we can see empirically, at least in some scenarios, what might happen, right? Whether Selgin is right, that you can in fact have reserve ratios lower than 1 and it's fine, or if Rothbard is right. And we're not saying that this would be universal, but it would apply in whatever type of commerce is posited for the simulation. Do you think that's accurate, or if I missed something?
Everything you said is true. Let me just take one more pass at filling in some of this stuff.
Yes,
before
please.
we dive. So folks, again, just to tease you, we have a bunch of the results, and Ian has a whole slide deck that he's going to walk us through here to show our preliminary results. Right. So a lot of this came from is my constant arguments with George Selgin on this stuff. And so, yeah, one of the main theoretical points is, and this isn't purely just arguing for the sake of arguing, even though that's always fun, but it's also, it does shed light on the economics of it. Like, just to say, because one of the central claims, and what George and I debated at the Soho Forum, was, is fractional reserve banking per se economically distortionary? I forget the exact words we used, but does it promote economic instability? Maybe it was something we said like that. Meaning that we're all against central banks. Selgin and White are actually in favor of commodity money. Like, I think White is favorable to Bitcoin too. Like, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and if people want to go into Bitcoin, that's cool, which is my position too, obviously. But so it's not that they're for, fiat money, certainly not issued by a coercive government, but they are big proponents of a laissez-faire free banking system where bank reserves, even on demand deposits, might be very low. And they point to the low ratios in, I think in some years it was like single digits in Scotland during their experiment in so-called free banking, and think that that's like, oh yeah, that's the market in action. Whereas, Rothbard was very critical, and the more I looked into that, I thought, yeah, there's all kinds of reasons not to say that that's a genuinely free market in banking, the Scottish example. And so, but having said all that, really specifically what we're doing, like the simulations you've been running, Ian, and the results I think you're going to present, as we'll flesh out in a moment, folks, when we expel the assumptions, it's more just testing the narrow claims that I said. I mean, it does shed light on these other questions, but first of all, we need to establish, is it true that, other things equal, if all the banks started with reserve ratios of 99% and they all had a certain, market share of clients in the community, and it worked where, they all accepted each other's notes or claims at par, but settled up with each other through vault cash, then it's just, it's a question to say, is it true that if one bank then lowers its reserve ratio, and partly what I wanted to know was, is it just a one-shot adjustment, or is it like there's a flow and eventually they run out? So those are two different things. And so that was partly I was just trying to test my intuition. Even if it turned out that the answer was yes, that doesn't mean that Rothbard's right and Murphy's right and Selgin and White are wrong, because there's benefits of lowering your reserve ratio. You can make more interest off of loans and things, so which, right now we don't have in our model, right? So I'm just saying it, but I want to at least get those forces down just to check the intuition. And like I said, also to see, is it like a one-shot adjustment or is it a flow over time? And eventually you necessarily run out. So those are the issues. So my point is like, you're right. It does touch on all these areas. And ultimately, as we keep adding bells and whistles, that's where I'm going with this, is to see, does this help resolve any of these issues? One last thing I'll say before I forget, folks. So Selgin and White, I believe their most rigorous, spelled out formal model was in their 1994 JEL, Journal of Economic Literature piece. Selgin had a whole book. I mean, maybe that stuff's all wrapped up into his book too. I don't know off the top of my head. Where they have like an actual model. Here's the equilibrium conditions on the margin. Here's what the optimizing bank does when it's deciding, do we want to issue more fiduciary media or stop? And there's pros. You keep inflating up to the point at which the marginal benefit is lower than the marginal cost. And so the more you inflate, you're increasing the chance that you're going to run out of vault cash, but you're getting more interest income, right? So anyway, that's the thing. But it's, again, so just me testing those intuitions at the very least, Ian. So like if what I'm saying is wrong, then I need to stop saying that, so there's always that element too.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we should go through the deck then.
Okay.
But prior to that, I want to distinguish among at least four things that we'll be discussing here. And it's important to keep these things straight, especially when you're talking about probability. One is outcomes, which is just, something that could happen. One is expected values. And so to distinguish between those, for instance, when you roll a die, your outcomes are 1 through 6, but the expected value is 3.5. Which of course never occurs.
Right.
But it's the average roll value over time. And so it's important to distinguish among these things when we have this discussion. Another has to do with the asymptotic behavior, that is to say the long run behavior of these kinds of systems that we're going to describe. And finally, what would happen in practice from a gambler's ruin standpoint. We'll talk about that. And then also we need to distinguish between simulation versus acting man, because acting man is in fact not a random variable.
Right.
So,
okay. Very good. All right. So you want me to let this go up there?
Yeah, I think you need to press something. There we go.
There
Cool.
you go.
Okay. So here we go. That's what we're going to discuss. All right. So to set this up, so this was the simulation that Bob asked me to perform. And here are some of the assumptions that we did. So the banks expand right away. So the reserve ratio is applied to all the specie. And so if you have
actually, can I stop you, Ian?
Yeah, go for it.
Even right there, what you're saying is true, but just the model we're assuming here is that the banks, it's a gold-based economy. Yes. So the ultimate base money are gold coins, let's say. And then people can deposit their gold coins into bank vaults and they get pieces of paper, bank notes issued by that bank that, have the bank's name on it. So like the note, you can tell which bank issued it. And then that thing allows you to go to any such bank and present that note and get a gold coin. And then the people go out in the community and they trade, those notes are all accepted at par. And that's the model. And so when Ian says expand right away, what he's saying is if the reserve ratio is below 100%, we assume right at the outset the bank already printed up all those additional notes. Like if it's going to have a 50% reserve ratio, it's already printed up twice as many notes as there are gold coins in its vaults and distributed those to people in the community. Okay.
Correct.
So, All right, I'll go ahead. I just wanted to give people that context so they understood what you're talking about.
Yep. So 100 pieces of gold in, reserve ratio 50%, 200 banknotes out. Each iteration, and so this was another, say, parameter. We'll find out, in fact, that it's not really important. But one of the parameters in the simulation was this constant that at each iteration. And so what's going to happen is you're going to specify a certain number of agents in the community, right? So you might have a town of 10,000 people or something like that. And at each iteration of commerce, what's going to happen is each agent is going to interact with one other agent, and they are going to spend some fixed percentage of the money that they have. That could be 20%, it could be 1%, it could be 90%, it could be whatever. But that's what's going to happen. And then after each iteration of commerce, the banks all settle up with each other. Each bank now has a collection of notes. Some are theirs, some are the other banks. And then they, get the other banks on the phone and say, pay up, and then return the notes to the bank. And that's what happens. And so, of course, it's a general amount of time, right? It could be a day, a week, a month, whatever. So that's the general setup.
Can I stop you right there?
Yeah.
Because again, we want to make sure. Don't worry, folks. Once we get going here, we'll move quickly through the material and the results. But it would kind of be silly to go through all that if you really don't even understand what we're doing. So the idea is that originally, and we're going to allow for variation, but originally, some banks might have 100% reserves, other banks might have 50%, other banks might have 10%, and we're just going to see what impact does that have. And so each bank's clientele goes out into the community with a bunch of banknotes in their pockets. And then they go and engage in commerce. And we sort of naively, simplistically assume that the way the commerce is simulated is every round, each agent randomly picks some other agent from whom they buy things, and they pay with banknotes. And like how much they spend, we just say, well, it will be some percentage of their bankroll, of their wad, their cash balance. Okay. And then what happens is, like, let's say, Bank A has 10% of the community as its clientele, and its members all have a certain amount. They randomly pick people. So sometimes Bank A customers in a given round will spend money on other Bank A customers. So that doesn't affect Bank A's gold holdings in its vault, because it's just the Bank A's customers just rearrange their holding of Bank A banknotes, and that's what they like. But what happens if somebody who banks at Bank B buys something because he randomly picks someone from Bank A, that person will accept the Bank B banknotes in the transaction. That's what it means to say they're all accepted at par. But then the idea is he goes and deposits Bank B's notes at Bank A to exchange them for Bank A notes, and then Bank A presents the Bank B notes over to Bank B when things settle down. And so if there's offsetting claims, if A's clientele has spent it in the aggregate as much buying stuff from Bank B's clientele as vice versa, they all just cancel out. But if Bank A's customers on net bought more stuff from Bank B's customers than vice versa in a given time period, well, now there's a net claim when Bank B presents it through the clearinghouse. And so Bank A has to settle up by taking gold out of its vault and shipping it over to Bank B, right? So and this is all, if you've read Rothbard or my stuff on it, this is all consistent with that story. We're just trying to formalize it and do it in a simulation. So that's the idea. And so where we're going with this is to see, does the bank's policy in terms of it at round zero, when they decide how many extra notes are we going to print up and put them in the hands of our clients, other things equal, that's going to make those clients able to go spend more. And so statistically, you're probably going to have more of a net drain because of that. And just to see what impact, numerically does that have on the amount of coins you got in the vault.
Yep. All right. Thank you, Bob. Okay. So just to illustrate this real briefly, we've got this slide here. And is there a way for me to get a pointer? So I can point.
I don't know.
Okay. Should have asked before we started rolling. Oh, well, I'll just speak my way through this. So one way you can think about this is at the beginning of the simulation, there's three guys here. We got Selgin, Murphy, and some guy, and we each have $100 in notes. And then we do one round of commerce. And in that round, and the spending parameter here is 10%. So in that first round, Bob gives $10 to Selgin. I really like Selgin, so I also give him $10. And Selgin likes Bob, so he gives Bob $10. So Bob has net, he still has $100 at the end of that. Selgin's up 10. I'm down 10.
Mm-hmm.
Then we go through the
so
second.
People can see that going from the first column into the middle column.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. That's why Selgin went from 100 to 110. I stayed the same, and you went down 10?
I went down 10. Yep.
Okay.
But now, because the spending parameter is 10%, now Selgin's, he's got big, deep pockets. He's going to spend $11 this time. Murphy's only going to spend 10. I'm going to spend 9. And so Selgin feels bad for me. He gives me $11. I spend 9. I'm up 2. Bob gives Seljan another 10. So Seljan's down to 109. And then I give Bob $9. So now Bob's at 99. And so that's how this goes, ad infinitum, if you will, or until I run out of memory. So
Okay. So among other things, and I'm sorry if I'm anticipating, we structured this where folks, like, nobody can ever run out of cash, right? Because at any given stage, you're only spending some fraction of your available cash. So if somebody happens, so the idea is because the things are randomly picked, it could possibly be with 10,000 people, it could be 999 other people all randomly pick the same guy.
Correct.
And he just goes into round 2 with this huge boatload of money.
Correct.
But then he's going to spend a lot more in round 2 than everybody else does, because everybody else can't barely spend it all. And then whereas that fixed percentage of now his boatload is a bigger outflow than he's getting. So the idea is, if you track any individual's cash balance longitudinally, it'll stray up and down because of the randomness, but there are reasons that as it gets above average, it would tend to, he would tend to spend more than he receives, and going the other way. If you are the person in the community with the least amount of money, you're going to spend less than everybody else. And statistically, probably more people are going to be spending on you than vice versa. So your cash balance will start recovering.
Right. Or what would that be? The marginal utility of money. You got a lot more money, you're willing to spend a lot more money.
Yeah, I mean, that would be the economics of it. But yeah, I'm saying in terms of the way the simulation's working, yes.
Sure, yeah. So that's that illustrates what's going on there. And so then the question is, okay, now there's 3 guys here, but what if you have, 100 guys, 1,000 guys, 10,000 guys, that sort of thing. And then you do like lots of iterations of it. What actually happens? Okay, so and then the questions we're trying to answer are, okay, well, what happens in the long run when we do this a bunch of times? And once we've done that, what is the distribution of specie, right? Because at the end of each iteration, the banks are all settling up with each other. And so, it's like, well, are some winning or some losing? Are they losing gold? Are they getting gold? And in particular, how is that related to their reserve ratios? So we want to know the distribution of specie because we're interested in solvency, and we're also kind of interested in the reserve ratios that each of these banks hold. So that's what we're going to investigate. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we investigate the long run behavior? And so to answer that question, I want us to forget about banking for just a second and go through this relatively simple example. This is one that I would give to my students when I was teaching business calc, because we had to teach them about matrices in there. And it turns out that matrix arithmetic governs the simulation that we just defined there. And, admittedly, my business calc students were like, what do we have to learn this for? And so I wanted to show them like an application of it. And so this is an example, a very simple example of what's known as a Markov chain. And so here are the sort of the 3 pieces of information you need. And you say, okay, suppose that you have, 2 populations, you got rural and you got urban. And each year, 30% of the rural population goes, enough of these cornfields, I'm moving to the city. 20% of the urban population says, enough of this noise, I'm moving to the country. And at the beginning of it, 30% of the population lives in the country, is rural. Okay, so now we have some sort of dynamic system going on here. People are moving from here to there and from there to here. Mm-hmm. So what happens? Can you say anything? Like maybe it's just like completely random. Who knows? Can you say anything? Well, the answer is actually yes, you can say something. And so although it's a busy slide in a certain sense in terms of computation, all you do is you simply apply these movements again and again. So we start, iteration 0 here, where you got 30% rural and 70% urban. You apply the movement statistics. You take 70% of your rural, they're sticking around in the country, and then you take 20% of the 70% that's in the city, and you come up with 35% are now in the country. And so 35% are in the country, then 65% are in the city, right? Mm-hmm. And then you just do that again. You take your 70% that are going to stay in the country, apply it to the 35%, take the 20% that are in the city that are going to move to the country, apply that. What do you get? 37.5 are now in the country. 62%, 62.5% are in the city. at the end of iteration 2. And so you say, oh, wow, the country's really gaining some people here. Is eventually everybody just going to move to the country? It's like, yeah, maybe. I don't know. Let's see what happens. So, and again, all of this calculation here is governed by matrix arithmetic. And so if you expand this chart, so we've duplicated the first 3 rows here, 0 through 2, you can do it again for the third iteration. You can see rural population goes up. But what you can see is that the increase in the rural population is beginning to attenuate. And so if you go down to the 10th iteration, you're at 39.99%. And the infinity symbol is not displaying here, but there's an infinity symbol for the last row here.
Steve Patterson got in and programmed it. Yeah.
He's outside my house in the bushes with a machete right now. So what happens is that asymptotically, the long run behavior is that 40% of the population is going to be in the country and 60% of the population is going to be in the city. And in fact, if you apply those movement parameters to it now, you take 70% of the 40, well, 4 times 7 is 28, and then you take 20% of the city, 6 times 2 is 12, 28 and 12 gives you 40. And so you find yourself in this equilibrium state long term with your population movements here. And so now, instead of thinking of population movements, what you can think about is banknote movements. And instead of moving between urban and rural, you can think about moving amongst agents in the banking simulation. So this is a simple example there. Okay. So like I already said, this behavior can be represented what I refer to as the commerce matrix. And basically the commerce matrix is a representation of who interacted with who in terms of each iteration. And like I say, these matrices have a very nice property. They're known as Markov matrices, and these things are well studied. And in particular, their asymptotic or their long-term behavior is well known. And so that's good to know. And it should also be observed that the expected amount. So here's where we're going. We have to think in terms of expected values versus actual observed outcomes, right? So the observed outcomes are the dollar holdings of each person at iteration 100, right? Versus the expected, what would you expect on average a person to be holding at iteration 100? So the expected amount of specie held by each bank at the end of each iteration, well, that's the expected amount of banknotes each person is holding for, who banks with that bank, minus the original amount of banknotes plus the amount of specie deposited. So it's the change in banknotes plus the original amount of specie. And so finally,
is that intuitive? Let me just think that through. Okay, so a given bank, we want to say like how many? Let's just say it's all ounces.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's each coin is 1 ounce of gold, and each note says the bearer of this can turn into the bank and get 1 ounce of gold upon demand. Okay, so we're saying for a given bank, how many gold coins are sitting in its vault on some given timestamp, and you say, well, it's the expected amount of the bank notes that bank has issued that are outstanding. Is that what that means?
So take the amount of notes that it has now at the end of iteration n. Well, let's just say at the end of the first iteration, right? Subtract the original amount of banknotes, so we got the change there, and then add the original amount of specie to it.
Okay. Yes, because let me make sure people are seeing why that. Because I think that first one, they're like, wait, why would if there are more notes held by bank A notes held by the community at time 100, why is that pushing up, other things equal, the amount of coins in the vault? Because there's not continued inflation occurring, right? The way this model works is they print up all their notes at time 0, and that's where the inflation comes in. Like if you say, with the reserve ratio is only 20%, they printed up all those additional notes. And so what would it mean then to say, oh, there are more bank A notes at time 100 than there were at time 1 or 0 even? It's because remember how the model works, folks, is that let's say you're Bank A customer, and then a Bank B customer buys something from you. The way we kind of simulate it is Bank B's customer notes, Bank B notes went down. Like he had 10 in the beginning, now he has 8. And so now 2 Bank B, printed bank notes, because the notes, they're not homogenous. They're all like, unique to, they're idiosyncratic, unique to each bank. So now the guy he's a client of Bank A has added to his cash balance during that phase 2 notes issued by Bank B. So he's willing to accept them at par. He sells something that, merchandise that has a value of 2 gold coins, and he takes 2 Bank B notes in exchange for it. But he's not just going to add that to his wallet and walk around town now with some Bank A notes and some B. He will go to his bank, A, and say, here's 2 Bank B notes. And then A will say, we'll take those, thank you, and here, and give them 2 Bank A notes. And then the reason Bank A does that is because they go to Bank B and say, here's 2 of your notes, give us 2 gold coins.
Right.
Right. And so that's why, folks, you can see why this equation makes sense. So over time, if there are a growing number of your bank's notes in the community in this model, it's not because you're granting more loans in fiduciary media. That was already handled in step 0.
We inflate right away.
Yeah. It's that over time, your customers are accumulating more net inflow of payments than vice versa. And then during the clearinghouse, you make them whole so that you just want your customers holding your bank notes. And then you settle up with the other banks and you insist on getting gold backed 1-to-1 every time you do that. Does that make? I'm partly doing this for myself too, Ian, just to make sure. Okay, that makes sense. That you agree with what I just said?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So given that, then now, this equation you've written here makes total sense.
So, right. So that's and again, like the easiest way to see it is just to do like 2 lines on a spreadsheet and go, okay, well, if they're holding this and holding that, then that's what comes out of it. That's the arithmetic. And then so that's the equation. And so again, we're interested in the long-term, specie holding of this, because if we understand the long-term specie holding, then, everything else follows, right? Solvency follows, reserve ratios follow, and all that stuff. Okay. And we've just now associated long-term specie holding with long-term expected number of banknotes, right? And it turns out that like we just illustrated with the people moving between rural and urban, the long-term expected banknote holding can be understood via matrix multiplication, understood via Markov chains. And so we can actually calculate that. All right. So the results are as follows, and this is not immediately obvious. I don't think this was obvious to you when you asked for this particular simulation. But the long-term expected distribution of banknotes is uniform among all actors. And so it doesn't matter what your spending parameter is. It doesn't sans a very special case. If there's only 2 agents and the spending parameter is 100, then we're each tossing sacks of gold at each other. I
wanted to chime in, defend my honor. I don't know if I knew that when I gave you the instructions, but when I summarized in the beginning, when you had the picture of you, me, and Seljan up there, it was immediately clear to me that the result was going to be in the long run that everybody holds the same amount of, well, that's just, the dollars, but same number of notes.
Yeah.
Right. Because as I explained, that if somebody on average has more notes than the typical person, he's going to spend more than the typical person. So his, you know what I mean? So just saying it in that way, that clearly it's going to be the case over time that everyone tends to have the same number of notes.
Well, it wasn't clear to me.
Okay.
When I was doing this originally, that the spending parameter can be 1% or 99%, and it all leads to the same place, which is that everybody's holding the same number of notes. And so what does that mean then? What's the implication of that? The implication is that the notes outstanding for each bank is proportional to its customers. And with that in mind, then you can actually compute the expected specie holdings and reserve ratios. So now, in order to do that, I write here, I think it's instructive to think in terms of 2 banks. And so let me explain.
Can I stop you, Ian?
Sure.
I want to make sure people weren't losing. So that second bullet point, again, folks, one of the assumptions we made in the parameters and stuff is at the beginning, we just assign market share. So there is just a fixed number of people. They are bank A clients, period. And that's going to be true for the whole simulation. And so when he's saying proportional to its customers, he means like if there's 10,000 people and we said, person 1 through person 1,500 are bank A clients and 1,501 through 3,500 are bank B clients and so on. That's what he's saying. So if one bank has twice as many customers as the other one, doesn't matter how you set it up, what spending parameter you use, in the long run, there are going to be twice as many of the bank's notes that have twice as big the customer base.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So, like I said, I think it's instructive to think in terms of two banks, and here's what I mean by that. So think about it.
Sorry, I yada over your third and fourth bullet point. Are you going to go back?
Well, no, just that the point is that we know what long-term specie is going to be in terms of long-term banknote holding, right? We can calculate long-term banknote holding, which means we can calculate long-term specie, which means we can calculate expected solvency and expected reserve ratios.
Folks, let's take a break from the action for this important announcement. If you care about your liberty and your financial freedom, you need to hear this. From October 10th through 12th, Mikkel Thorup, host of the Expat Money Show, who's been a guest on this program, is bringing together top experts from around the world for the Expat Money Online Summit, and it's completely free to attend. You'll learn how to legally protect your wealth, secure second residencies and citizenships, reduce your tax burden, and own property abroad, all to safeguard your freedom. This year's focus is Latin America, where opportunity is booming. Argentina is shifting to free markets, and as an aside, word on the street is that Milei recently told his top lieutenants that they should go read my booklet, Chaos Theory. True story. That really happened. El Salvador is undergoing a dramatic transformation, and Panama and Paraguay are offering simple residency programs. A Plan B is no longer optional, it's essential. So reserve your free ticket at expatmoneysummit.com. That's EXPAT moneysummit.com. expatmoneysummit.com for your free ticket. Do it today. Let's get back to the show now. Hang on, for point 3, you can see, folks, I didn't have time to review this slide deck beforehand. That's why we're just seeing. I think we thought this would be instructive for you to see my thought process. Okay, I mean, I get how if you knew the expected amount of specie per bank, the reserve ratio would be trivial, corollary. It's not obvious to me. I totally get. I see how what the proportions would, like I said, if Bank B has twice as many customers as Bank A, I totally get how that means. Yeah, and so since every individual in the long run is going to have the same number of banknotes in their cash balance, that means, and remember, folks, they settle up. So every period at the end, everyone who's a Bank B client is holding only Bank B notes, right? That's a critical element in all this. And so, yeah, that means, but how do I know, Ian? And we obviously know like how many gold coins exist. That doesn't change. There's not like mining that occurs in this model. So it's just got rearrangement. But why is it? What's the step from in the beginning? For all we knew, one bank had 10 gold coins backed up or backing up 10,000 notes, and another thing had 1,000 gold coins backing up 1,000 notes. It's not obvious to me. How do we know how the gold is distributed in the vaults? Just from thinking through what we've been thinking through here.
Because we know that at each iteration, the expected amount of banknotes, the expected amount of specie is the expected amount of banknotes minus the original amount of banknotes plus the original amount of specie. So in other words,
okay. Yes, I got you. So it's not that it's not proportional necessarily. It could be that what they chose in the beginning clearly has an impact on what the long run asymptotic reserve ratio is.
It's what they chose in the beginning can be used to calculate.
Gotcha.
Exactly the expected holdings.
I forgot we had earlier pinned this one down. So you're saying yes, keeping that in mind. That's how in the next slide we can in the long. Yeah, I got you. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So the train of thought is what solvency and reserve ratios are function of banknote holding and specie. We can calculate long-term banknote holding. Because we can calculate long-term banknote holding, we can calculate long-term specie, which means we can calculate long-term solvency and long-term expected reserve ratios.
Yep. Okay. Incidentally, you're using solvency. By solvency, do you just mean that they don't run out of gold? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Just that, that everybody, all of their customers can redeem, that they don't run out of gold settling up the other banks.
Right. So,
Right.
yeah. So for you, insolvency in this model means some bank presents and says, hey, your customer spent on net 842 more than our customer spent on yours. And so here's 842 of your notes. We want 842 gold coins. And they look at, and they don't have 842 coins in their vault.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Because we know once you dip below 100% reserves, theoretically you could go out of business tomorrow if everyone came and present. Right.
Okay. Just as an aside, I just don't want people to get confused and also want to be anal. I go out of my way to be a real stickler, and that I'm not saying you're right. That's why I want to clarify, Ian, how we're using that term, because what I say, a lot of people will say, oh yeah, fractional reserve banking is inherently insolvent or bank. Every fractional reserve bank is bankrupt in its essence. And so I say, well, some people, when they're talking about insolvency, they mean that the liabilities are higher than their assets. And I say, no, if you take in a bunch of deposits into a checking account and go make a 30-year mortgage, you're not insolvent in the sense that your assets have a lower market value than your liability. You could still have positive shareholder equity. It's just you're very illiquid.
Right.
That, if somebody shows up, you have a cash credit, a liquidity crisis, right? So anyway.
Well, yeah, technically when banks expand, their assets do equal their liabilities.
Right. And that's partly why
all their loans in the right order, everything will be fine.
That's partly why I make that distinction. Just partly because the precision of the terminology, but also that it's not that fractional reserve bankers are stupid and they're just doing something like they know what they're up to. If the loans perform, then yeah, they did well. They generate net income and they add to their shareholder equity. So okay.
So in order to think about these things in terms of expected specie holdings, reserve ratios, solvency as I've used it, what word would you use instead of solvency for a bank which, when presented with its notes, can't pony up? Do you have a word for that?
I guess a liquidity crisis.
Okay. Illiquid, we'll say.
Yeah.
Okay. So when we're thinking about this with respect to a particular bank, I write it's instructive to think in terms of two banks, and here's what I mean. What I mean is that we should think in terms of us and them. And so from the perspective of bank one here, so suppose that there are three banks in the community, and I have done everything here in terms of average deposits and population percentages. So percentages and averages versus raw absolute numbers, because I think it works easier for the examples. Mm-hmm. So you've got three banks in the community, and we're going to concentrate on bank one for a moment here. And all the examples are going to be bank one versus bank two. And so how does bank one think about things? Well, bank one thinks about itself and there's others, right? And so how can you combine banks two and three in some reasonable fashion? Well, what you could think of is if they, combined today, if they went into a merger today, they would have 45% of the population would bank with them. And then their average deposit, bank two has an average deposit of 105, bank three has an average deposit of 120. You take the weighted average of the population weighted average of those, you get 115.
Hang on.
Yeah.
Average deposit means the average bank specie.
So in other words, if you take all the customers of bank two, some bring more gold, some bring less. But on average, each person brought 105 coins.
Okay.
That's what
that's why I want to distinguish that between, how many notes are they holding? So you're saying that's not saying if somebody's walking around town with 100 banknotes from bank one, that's not what you're getting at. Well, because the reserve ratio is 1. So pick bank two.
Yeah.
To say 105, what does that mean? Does that mean people brought in 105 ounces of gold?
On average, people brought in 105 ounces of gold, and then
and so there's more. The average bank two customer is holding more than 105 bank two notes.
The average bank two customer is holding 105 divided by 0.9 notes.
Right. Okay. Yep. And dividing by something less than 1 makes the thing go up. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yep. And so now if banks 2 and 3 merge, the average deposit there is going to be 115. Of course, I cooked all the numbers ahead of time to make them nice. And then if you do a little bit of arithmetic, you can figure out that the reserve ratio for this new combined bank is 0.828. And so that's just adding up all the gold from both of the banks, adding up the number of notes outstanding, and then just taking the ratio.
Yep. Okay.
So does that make sense?
It makes sense, but what is that? Are you doing something with this, or was that the punchline?
No, that's not the punchline at all. It's just
okay. Yes, I'm following you so far. Yes.
Yeah. No, it's just that when you're doing these simulations, when you increase the number of banks and you increase the number of agents, the numbers get large very fast, and it's like, well, how do you summarize these results in some reasonable fashion, which you can easily communicate? And I guess the other thing is, from the standpoint of thinking in terms of illiquidity and reserve ratio violations or that sort of thing, basically you're going to be fixing a bank, right? You're going to be taking, bank X and saying, okay, this much gold went in initially. They had this reserve ratio. What's the long-term holding, for this guy? And so it's like, well, if you're concerned about bank X, you're worried about bank X versus everybody else. Right. And so that's the thinking here, is that you can analyze bank X in terms of itself and everybody else is the idea.
Oh, okay. So you're showing why without loss of generality, we can proceed as if there's only 2 banks.
Correct. Yep.
I gotcha. Okay. Yep.
For the purposes of illustration.
For these purposes. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a simple way to illustrate the answer to the original queries. Mm-hmm. So from here on out, there's just going to be us and them, bank 1, bank 2, red team, blue team. Okay. So this is the first of 6 examples that we're going to go through. And so the arithmetic is going to be the same on each slide. So let's go through it now to, just make sure we understand it. So this is sort of the classic example that I think that you had in mind when you talked about this in times past, right? Is you got bank 1, they got half the population, average deposits 100. And these guys are just freewheeling. They got their 25% reserve ratio. And meanwhile, you have these, start shirt conservatives over at Bank 2 with a 100% reserve ratio. Mm-hmm. What happens long term? Okay, well, how many banknotes were what's the average number of banknotes long term? And the answer is, well, Bank 1, you're going to take that 100, you're going to divide it by 0.25. That's going to come up with 400. Meanwhile, bank 2 is just going to have 100, on average per person. And then when you average that across the population, it's 50-50. That means the average number of bank notes that each person is holding is 250. Because again, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, this is great. And I like the way you're doing this. Okay, so let me just say this for the listeners, but also make sure you confirm it. So the way to read this table is, yes, in the beginning, again, we're assuming each bank has half the population. The average person turned in 100 gold coins. They originally get 100, banknotes for that. Okay, so they each got those.
For bank 2, they get 100 banknotes.
Well, no, for bank 1 as well. It's not that bank 1 is just handing out notes 4 for 1. They're making loans.
I'm saying
economically, right?
Yes,
so there's that. But then I'm saying,
yes.
So then bank 2 just says, hey, that's all our business model is. We just, how do we make our money? Through volume. If you ever saw that Saturday Night Live. And so bank 2, like maybe they just charge a modest service fee or something that we're not including in the simulation here. But bank 1 says, oh, well, on any given day, it's not like all of our customers are going to show up and want to get the gold coins out. So instead of all the coins just sit in the vault, we'll print up more notes and lend them out and earn interest, right? So we don't have the interest and why are they doing that and the credit worthy. We don't have any of that in the model. But what we do have is to say they print up so there's more bank 1 notes. And to say there's ultimately a reserve ratio of 25% means for the total amount of outstanding notes, only 25%. So if there's 100 gold coins in the vault, there's 400 total bank 1 notes out there held by the community, originally by the people who are the half of the people who bank with bank 1. And then there's 100 notes that bank 2 originally prints up. So there's 500 notes total.
Yep.
And then, as we've seen, in the long run, if everybody just spends X% of their cash holdings every period on a randomly selected recipient, over time, it's got to be in the long run that every individual holds roughly the same amount of cash, the same amount of notes. And because we've said that the way it works is if you end up holding a note that your rival, issued by a bank that you don't bank at, you go turn that into your bank and get replaced with your bank's note, and then it goes and redeem. So in the long run, it's got to be of the 500 total notes printed, it breaks down to 250 and 250 because they each, 1 and 2, each have half the population as market share.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And so then we just apply our fun little equation that says, okay, well, on average, your average guy, he's holding 250 notes. Bank One issued 400. They started with 100 specie. They're negative. And so they've gone illiquid, and their reserve ratio is negative as well. Then,
okay, so let me stop you there, and don't worry, folks, I won't keep stopping Ian for every example here. We know there must be a problem because on average, the clients of Bank One are going to hold 250 notes, and the same thing with Bank Two, and we know there's only 200 gold coins collectively on average, like
collectively,
yeah. And so it can't be that each bank has enough in the vault to back up its outstanding 250 notes.
Well, right, but Bank Two can, because it's got that reserve ratio of 100. And so at this point, because the way the simulations were run is that we just allowed banks to go into debt. We allowed them to be illiquid. But this is what's going to happen is that because they issued 400, now the average person is holding 250. When you look at that difference, again, that's just applying that equation we discussed a few slides ago. They're illiquid. They're at negative 50.
When you say long-term average specie there in the second bullet point,
yeah,
who is that? Is that just for Bank One?
That's just for Bank One.
Okay, so I misunderstood. I thought you were just talking about the macro results.
No. So what I'm saying is for any of these analyses, you're going to be selecting a bank and saying,
got you. Yeah,
I need to examine this bank. And so for these examples, the bank we're examining is always Bank One.
Okay, got you. So you're here. We're kind of saying if the rest of the banks, have 100% reserves and Bank One just chooses to have 25% reserves, what ends up happening? I got you.
Yeah, Bank One goes in, they're all cavalier. I'm going to clean up on these idiots. I'm going to expand the money supply. Nope. It's at least not in the simulation, right?
Okay. And so to say the long-term average reserve ratio is negative means
for Bank One.
Yes, that they've, in the long run, they are going to be under, they have run out of gold. That's what that means.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. They've taken on debt from something outside of the simulation.
So if the long run, maybe we'll get it. If the long run reserve ratio had been 1%, that could have been scary, but technically that doesn't mean they went under because they still could have some gold in the vault. But the fact that it's what's popping us in the long run, we would expect them at, iteration N as N goes to infinity to have negative 20% reserve ratio means we expect that eventually they, the other banks represented collectively here by Bank Two would have presented notes for redemption and they would have just run out of gold. Their vault would be empty. Okay.
Okay, so comfortable with this arithmetic?
Okay, and so there, to go back to what I said at the beginning, what I wanted to test is, at least for this particular parameter choice, it's not just that, it would be a one-shot adjustment and they would have a drain. It's saying, no, they would get wiped out. It's not just that
they
it would
would
be
get
precarious.
Yes,
so this would not work. Yes.
Correct. Yeah, they get annihilated. Yep. Okay, and so here's the thing. So I do the simulations. The simulations make me think, okay, what's the math about it? So I go and do the math. I figure out long term. It's not merely that the simulations show that things get evenly distributed long term. It's like the math itself. You can prove
right.
that.
Right.
Okay, and so with those equations,
because you and Markov chains have a history. You know how to analyze those things.
Actually, so this is the interesting thing about this is that although
I'm going to wait and see if this is actually going to be interesting, what you're about to say. Go ahead.
It's that I didn't have to appeal to Markov theory. It just so happened that the simulation you specified was of a sufficiently tractable nature that I was able to calculate all the stuff by hand without appealing to any sort of theory.
That is kind of interesting.
Thank you. And so with those equations in hand, then with the long-term equations,
I'm so sorry. Are you going to, if you just say, yes, Bob, that's where I'm going, then I'll shut up. But what you just did here, that raises the question, is there something special about the 25? Or if you had done Bank One has a 99% reserve ratio, would it still be the same answer?
Oh, my friend, that's where we're going.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah,
lead us, good sir.
Yes, with the equations in hand, I then sought to try out different scenarios. Like, well, if you change these parameters and those parameters, what can happen, and can I force certain things to happen? You know, if I put in sufficiently egregious numbers, say for instance. So again, we know at the outset that if you have a 100% reserve ratio, it's like everything's golden from a liquidity standpoint, from a, yep, we're keeping our promises with respect to reserve ratio standpoint. Once you drop below 100%, and so this sort of buttresses the Rothbardian framework or viewpoint. Once you drop below 100%, anything can happen. And so that's what the next 5 slides are going to show. That anything can happen. So here's the first one. This is the most egregious. So in particular, if anything can happen, Bank One, the bank under consideration now, is going to have a higher reserve ratio than Bank Two. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to have it serve a very tiny percent of the population. And I'm going to have those people put in way more gold than the people in Bank Two. And when you do that, of course, I've cooked these numbers up ahead of time. When you do that, it actually turns out that Bank One goes illiquid, even though it has a higher reserve ratio.
This table has warped my fragile little mind. Well,
That's why
I believe you,
Yeah.
but you need to convince me.
Okay.
My faith. Give me the faith.
Sure. Help down my unbelief. So ask yourself, all right, well, what's going to be the long-term average number of banknotes? All right. Well, so you're going to take the 2241, you're going to divide it by 0.9. That's going to come to this number here, the 2490. You know, you weight that with the 104 divided by 0.8, gives you 248 long-term average banknotes. So this is just the application of the arithmetic that we've done previously. What's the long-term average species? So we just,
and the reason the per capita long-term is so low is because that 2241 is only concentrated among 5% of the population
5%.
originally. And that's why the weighted is only 200 something. Okay.
Right. So I wanted to, I knew this would be a fun conversation. So we're going to go through the arithmetic, and then I also have a verbal description of what's going on here.
Okay.
So that's the 248, right? It's so low because it's only 5% of the population. You subtract off the original bank notes that they issued, 2490. You compare that with the original out of specie, and you wind up, of course I did it, so it just inched over 0. Now, why is this happening, say, verbally? Well, what's happening is, again, remember that it doesn't matter what your spending parameter is and that sort of thing. At the end, in the long run, everybody's just holding the same number of notes. And so what you've got then is you've got a whole load of notes that are coming from Bank One because the average deposit is so large. There's a ton of notes that they have out there. Yes, their reserve ratio is higher than Bank Two, but it doesn't matter because there's so many more notes because of the original amount of specie deposited there. And so what that means then is a lot of the Bank Two customers are holding a lot of those notes. And so then when they go to Bank Two, they say, here's the Bank One notes. You go deal with Bank One. Bank Two goes to Bank One and says, fork it over. And they go, right. And so that's the verbal description of what's going on here. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yep. I'll say it just for the listener. Yeah, I totally. So again, the intuition is, and Ian did a good job here where he realized there's different variables and he's just coming up with crazy combinations that are very counterintuitive. And that's the point of this.
Yes.
Is that he's saying with this particular example, Bank One has a small group of people that have a lot of gold. They've got 22 times as much gold rounding as the average person of Bank Two. We're talking about here the top 5% of the wealth holders.
Yeah.
So they go and they all happen to bank at Bank One, which is for the cream of the crop, and then Bank Two, is the stand-in for all the other banks that are just the community banks and whatnot. All right, and so if we assume, and I'm just imagining like a Sel General White trying to attack me if I go in that this is what they would attack, is if we just assume that the way commerce and spending occur is people just every single person in the community spends a given fraction of their cash balances each period, then that means over time, those Bank One customers who started out with 2241 of gold coin, they're going to end up spending a lot more on Bank Two's clientele than vice versa. And so that means over time, everybody's cash balances tend towards uniformity. And then because that's the case, that clearly means, given what the original scenario was, that over time, every period on average, Bank Two is going to Bank One and saying, here's some Bank One notes that we have on net from your customers to ours. And these notes say we turn these in and we get gold coins. And so that's why, even though Bank One does originally have 90% backing, they still are getting presented with a bunch of redemption requests. And so that is draining them. And just the way the numbers he picked are that they still run out, even though they had a higher reserve ratio in the beginning.
Yep. And the real takeaway, well, there's multiple takeaways, but one of them is once you drop below 100%, anything can happen, right? And this is sort of the worst case of anything happening, right? This is, I think, the most counterintuitive example that I'm going to show you. After this, everything else is...
Okay. So in particular, so this is good that it's clarifying, like, it's not... My intuition was sound in the sense what I was picturing in my mind when I used to say, summarizing, oh yeah, you have the banks all start out the same reserve ratio and then one lowers it. I was kind of implicitly assuming they all had roughly equal market share and balances and whatnot. But you're showing that no, it's if you got real specific, like that claim might not be true.
So that we could take the equations that come out of this and sharpen that intuition. So it's like, obviously the reserve ratio is important, right? Obviously that's driving this, right? But it's not the whole story.
Right.
And what is, as this, obviously this is a cooked up example, but what you can see is also partially driving this story is the average deposit, right? I mean, it's like the only reason this example works is because I just cranked up the average. I cranked up the average deposit on Bank One, and I way lowered the population with it. So okay, and so the next examples now are just sort of other things that can happen. So in this particular example here, now we have a bank. It's got a higher reserve ratio, and lo and behold, it gains gold. So it's like, yep, okay, this one confirms that. In this example,
so wait, could go back to that previous one, just so people know what you mean. So because Bank One started with a 90% reserve ratio, and then they ended up when the dust settles in the long run at 90.48%. Yeah, that's your point. Okay.
Yeah. So gold. So this is sort of the one that goes with the intuition, right?
Yeah.
It's higher reserve ratio, gold's flowing into it, right? And so it winds up with a larger reserve ratio than it started. Everything's kosher. All right, cool. Next, but compare this to the previous slide, right? So over here, massive average deposit, low population. What did I do to make it work here? Lowered the average deposit and made the population a little larger, right? In this example here now, we've got, low reserve ratio. Bank One has an 80. Bank Two has a 90, and yet gold flows into Bank One with this set of numbers here. And so this is an example where, again, you can have a lower reserve ratio and gold flows into you. In this particular example here now, you've got a lower reserve ratio, and this one goes along with your original intuition. Gold flows out, and you violate.
Can you go back to the previous one?
Yep.
Because this is the one that, let me make sure people get it. Here, so for sure, I don't want to be coy. Like, clearly, some of the statements I have been making thus far, like, they're not necessarily true, right? That you can come up with scenarios that where that. And so this is an example where you could imagine, like, oh yeah, if originally all the banks had 90% reserves, and then Bank One, which happens to have 40% market share, and customers who are a little bit less wealthy than the other ones on average, if it all of a sudden drops from 90 to 80, I would have said in my earlier framework, oh, then clearly we would expect gold to flow out of the vaults of Bank One and into the vaults of Bank Two. But you're showing, no, with this thing, if this is how we started at time zero and then let the thing run, in the long run, it ends up being that Bank One's actual reserve ratio inches up a little bit.
Right. And the way you can tell is, again, you got that 117 versus the 0.9 as opposed to the 100 versus the 0.8. And we can specify exactly what's happening later, more generally. But first, I wanted to show you examples of it happening.
Okay.
In this particular example, this one goes along with what you expect, right? Lower reserve ratio for Bank One. It's got an 80 versus a 90 for Bank Two. Gold flows out. That goes along with your previous intuition. They wind up with a 79.5 reserve ratio. And finally, in this example, you've got Bank One, higher reserve ratio, 90 versus an 80, but you've got that higher average deposit. And so it's producing, more notes, and gold flows out of it. And so it winds up at an 89.5 reserve ratio.
Okay. And
so you might say, okay, these are kind of fun examples. What's driving this? And the answer is that we said the long-term distribution of banknotes, we can calculate that. It's just uniform among the agents. That allows us to make statements about the long-term solvency and reserve ratios. And so here's the actual principle for which you're looking, is that it's not simply the reserve ratios that one's bigger and one's smaller. It's the application of those reserve ratios to the average amount of specie deposited. So it's the ratio. It's the number of banknotes. And so if you go back and look at these examples, here, the average number of banknotes created in Bank One exceeds the average number of banknotes created in Bank Two. And so that's what's causing gold to flow out of Bank One, even though it's got a higher reserve ratio. And so here's where your previous intuition was correct. It was correct if everybody starts with the same amount of gold. Because if everyone starts with the same amount of gold, then you got equal stuff. But then when you divide one by a smaller number, that goes up, which means that they've issued more banknotes. And so when Bank Two issues more banknotes on average than Bank One, gold flows out of Bank Two. When Bank One issues more banknotes on average than Bank Two, gold flows out of Bank One. And so your intuition was correct in the special case where everybody starts with the same amount of specie.
So I was like the Isaac Newton of banking theory.
I guess. Why do you say Isaac Newton?
Well, because what he came up with was quite rigorous and true for like the special case of when things weren't going near the speed of light.
Oh, you're talking about in physics. Right, that's right.
Yes.
You studied physics. I studied math. I was thinking in terms of calculus. I'm like, hey, you made calculus.
That's funny.
What are you talking about?
Right.
They're different perspectives. And so
I've always been a Leibniz guy. So
they each have their own use, the notations. So anyway, but here's the thing: is that you can actually, even though we don't have the equations displayed on here, they're kind of ugly. But if you write them a particular way, you can easily figure out exactly what's going on. And so, basically, you're going to potentially violate your reserve ratio if you are creating more banknotes on average than your competitors. And I have solvency here. We had the discussion earlier. So just replace solvency in your mind with, liquidity. Liquidity depends not only on the average number of banknotes, because of course, before you go illiquid, you first violate your reserve ratio, right? So therefore, liquidity depends not only on the average number of banknotes that are issued, but also the bank's market share. And so again, going back to the most egregious example, right? It's not only that bank won, when the average deposit was 2241. It's not only that they issued just a ton of banknotes, it's also that they had a very small amount of the market share.
Right.
And so that equation and
the intuition for that is because, again, the way the randomization works is, in general, if you only have 5% of the market share, your people are going to be spending more on non-clients than vice versa.
Correct. Exactly.
Whereas the typical so the bank 2 client in that scenario has a 95% chance of spending his notes to another bank 2 client. And so there's no drain of gold from bank 2 in that case, but okay.
Yep. So does that make sense before I address some of the
that makes sense. Yep.
Okay, cool. So now I said that we were going to concentrate on 4 things. One is outcomes. The other is expected behavior, asymptotic behavior, and gambler's ruin. And so I want to discuss a few of these things. One is that, again, once you dip, there's a few principles to take away here that I think would contribute to this general discourse about free banking. One is that once you go beneath 100% reserves, you're, at least, in these simulations, you're like anything can happen. That's what I was trying to communicate with those previous slides. Anything can happen. That's one thing. 2 is that in terms of outcomes, it could be the case that we mentioned earlier that everybody with, if you dip below 100, all of your clients spend their money on everybody else's clients, right? And so you actually could go insolvent at any time. It's on the table, right?
Right.
Or illiquid. Sorry, go illiquid at any time. It's on the table. So that's one point. But another point, and I think this is a bit more interesting, which is that are you familiar with gambler's ruin? Does that mean anything to you?
Yeah.
Okay. So for the listener, Bob and I are going to play a game where we each have 10 $1 bills, and we're going to flip a coin. And if it's heads, I give Bob $1. And if it's tails, he gives me $1. And so what happens then is that on average, at any point in time, the expected amount of dollars that Bob and I are going to have is 10. However, the long-term behavior of that system is eventually there's going to be some point in time where Bob has all $20 or I have all $20, in which case the game ends. And the same thing holds true for this, which is that when you dip below the 100% reserve ratio, there is some positive probability, however small, that you will go insolvent in that round. And so eventually it's going to happen in the long run to one of the banks. It might be gigantic numbers, but it's another example of the gambler's ruin that I just described. And so that's why I say,
let me just make sure. So the earlier stuff, when you're doing those tables and showing us the long, you were showing the long run. And so clearly if the long run reserve ratio was negative, that meant clearly that bank's going under, right? Because in the long run, it's going to tend to. But your point was, even in the other cases where it was just showing, this bank here in this example with these parameters, it starts with a reserve ratio of 80% and then goes down to 74.5. That doesn't mean everything is fine, because that was just the long run asymptotic behavior of that.
Right. You
were still staying in practice, just with the randomness of it. It just could happen to be that all of its clients spend on non-bank clients next round, and 0 of the other clients do it vice versa. And so there's a huge drain on their gold reserves. And depending on the parameters in their original reserve ratio, that might wipe them out in that round.
Right.
Even though in the long run, they were supposed to hover around 74.5% reserves, their actual reserves could go negative at step 18.
Well, exactly. And it's again, it's the difference between an outcome versus an expected value.
Mm-hmm.
The expected value is uniform distribution, right? That's the expected value.
Mm-hmm.
But the outcome that someone winds up with all the money, just like between you and I playing the game where we're flipping the coin, the outcome where, one bank winds up with, all of the notes of some other guy, that has some non-zero probability, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so another way to think of it is doubling down, right? Like if the casino lets you do it,
Right.
theoretically you'll make your money. So that's that. And then the final point I wanted to make about,
you just want to make sure people are getting it. In contrast, if banks practice 100% reserves, then it doesn't matter what happens. They never run out of gold, because worst case scenario, every last one of their customers spends everything on others and gets nothing in return. And then other banks present those notes and they say, yep. And when the very last note that they originally created is presented, they give that last gold coin in the vault. Nothing's in the vault, but there's no outstanding notes that they issued.
Correct.
And so that's why, okay.
Yeah. But then the other thing is that I think, at least a fair amount of this discussion, not necessarily tonight, but say the discourse, at least that which I've examined, is focused on liquidity. But what I'm thinking is, at least with respect to these simulations, when you have gold flowing out of you, if, for instance, if we go back here to this example, for example, you might say in the long-term behavior, on average, 6 gold pieces flowed out of bank one. It's like, yeah, okay, it's not that they're illiquid. However, they're in breach of contract. And so if you're thinking about this in terms of free banking, if bank one goes out there and says to their customers, hey, look, keep your gold with us. We're way more conservative than bank two. Those idiots, they got a reserve ratio they got notes all over town. We're nice and conservative here. We got a reserve ratio of 0.9. They're in breach of contract. So even though they might be liquid, they still are failing the promise that they've made to their customers. And so I think that's an important point.
Just to be clear, are you saying if their promise is we have a 90% reserve ratio, that's why you should?
Yeah. Because like you would imagine in a free banking situation, right? If banks are just allowed to do whatever,
Mm-hmm.
that one of the things that they would probably say is, hey, we're not like these other knuckleheads. We're conservative. We have a high reserve ratio, and you can come redeem your stuff at any time. It's safe with us, pal. If they advertise that, if they sign contracts that say that, even something like this, it's like, this isn't like a one-off thing like whoops-a-daisy. Again, this is the expected long-term asymptotic behavior. The expected long-term behavior is that they're in breach of contract. And so I think that just that in and of itself should be, I think that in and of itself is actually what would drive up, at least again in this set of scenarios, simulations, higher reserve ratios. It's not necessarily the illiquidity, it's the breach of contract. If that's, allowed on the courts. Depends on the contracts they sign. But anyway,
right.
That's the final statement I wanted to make about that.
Okay. So I think this is a good place to wrap up in terms, just because the length of this episode and so forth, and we threw a lot at the listener. Obviously, I'm just thinking through various, and people could come, they could say stuff like, well, geez, it's not like in the real world, the cash balances of the wealthiest 5% and the poorest 95% over time tend to be equal. What are you talking, right? So I would say that was one anticipation that you're right. That's not, but don't think of it as merging their wealth. We're talking here about cash holdings, and it's not true that Elon Musk has most of his money in a checking account balance, right? So there is that element here that we're talking about holding of bank notes, not overall portfolios. So it's not as unrealistic as you might have originally thought. And also too, like clearly this wasn't, hey, there's no such thing as a bank called Bank 3, so your model's unrealistic. Duh. You know what I mean? So this is obviously, we're just abstracting away from certain things to isolate some stuff. But this was very interesting, Ian. On the one hand, some of my statements weren't right. But on the other hand, this actually, maybe I'm just trying to turn that frown upside down. I think this is a more a result championing the benefits or the virtues of 100% reserve banking that I thought going into it.
Well, I think what we've shown is that the original intuition that it's only the reserve ratio, that part's not correct. It's not like it's completely off, but we've simply sharpened that. Now we can actually do computations with it, so that's good. I do want to address the point you just brought up because, of course, I thought of that too when I came across the result that all the banknotes are uniformly distributed. It's like, well, obviously that's not true, right? In practice. However, I do like, depending on where this all goes, you could, for instance, start with a distribution of banknotes that you think is going to be asymptotic. So like you just take the distribution of banknotes today, if that was publicly available or something, you could take that and then you could reverse this process. You could take that and you could come up with the long-term expected value matrix that corresponds to that distribution. And then you could come up with the commerce process that corresponds to that matrix. So there is a theoretical answer to that, at least.
Yeah. So I definitely think whatever we end up doing, and just so you know, folks, I think what I'll probably do, Ian, is write up like a blog post or something kind of summarizing some of what we did here to accompany this to help people. But if we do go further, what you've already done here and what we talked about is a necessary thing just to get us down that path, like to now say, okay, this is really cool, but now let's make it more realistic to be a better simulation of what actually happens. Because you're right, but it's interesting as I'm sitting here trying to think of how to do it. It's not, because we weren't saying everybody every period spends the same amount of money. No, we were saying you spend a proportion, which in the grand scheme doesn't seem that unreasonable, and yet that does have the result that pops out is everybody ends up with the same cash holdings, and that's wait a minute, what? So
right. Yep.
I think maybe part of it is going to be income, that really what you're spending, as I'm just walking through this right now with you on the fly here, Ian, as the camera's rolling, is that really every period of what economists assume is that people spend perhaps a fraction of their income or a fraction of their long-term expected income on consumption, for example. Whereas here we're doing it that no, what you spend every period is just what cash do you have. And we're not like, it's not like somebody has a job and then has a flow of income every period.
They're digging into their 401k.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, do you have any parting words for the good listeners that have made it this far?
Yeah, I hope it's clear that Austrian economists and mathematicians can come together.
Exactly. And you have a red tie on, but not a red bow tie. That's reserved for the economists.
That's right.
All right. Well, joking aside, thanks, Ian. This, if people can see, obviously. Also, folks, Ian has like a thing written up in the LaTeX format, right? With, very mathy looking, theorems and lemmas and such. So Ian and I are going to huddle, and maybe we'll end up getting some version of this published somewhere. But anyway, this is great stuff. Thanks so much, Ian.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, folks, for tuning in. See you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.